Good morning to you, and thanks for taking time to watch this message. I trust that this message finds you well and enjoying God's presence and goodness on your life. This morning, I'm going to be beginning a new series looking at what it means to be a disciple of Jesus. Paul writes to Timothy in the second book of Timothy, and he gives three metaphors to Timothy about what it means to be a church leader. And I also believe that these three metaphors, whilst being helpful to church leadership and to understanding what it takes and what's involved in church leadership, they're also true for us as disciples of Jesus Christ. And these three metaphors, I believe, will help us learn what it takes and what is necessary and what is involved in becoming and being a follower of Jesus day by day. So let's look at the verses together. It's in 2 Timothy chapter 2 and verses 3 to 7. And Paul writes, "Endure hardship with us like a good soldier of Jesus Christ. No one serving as a soldier gets involved in civilian affairs. He wants to please his commanding officer. Similarly, if anyone competes as an athlete, he must compete. He does not receive the victor's crown unless he competes according to the rules." And in verse 6, the hard-working farmer should be the first to receive a share of the crops. And then Paul writes, "Reflect on what I'm saying, for the Lord will give you insight into all this." So we have three images there, three metaphors: soldiers, athletes, and farmers. And over the next 3 Sundays, I'll be taking each of these images and exploring what is involved in those examples to help us become more effective in our discipleship journeys. Let's think about what it means to be a soldier this morning. The Bible is absolutely full, isn't it, of military language in various parts of the Bible, comparing the work of soldiers and soldiering to being disciples. Passages that spring to mind are Ephesians 6, where Paul writes and describes about putting on the armour of God. Paul writes to Timothy in the first book of Timothy, and he says, "Fight the good fight," to Timothy. And Paul writes to the church in Corinth in 2 Corinthians chapter 10, and he describes that the work of discipleship and how we fight in our spiritual warfare. And he says the weapons that we fight with are not the weapons of this world. On the contrary, they have divine power to demolish strongholds. There's a lot of language in the Bible about discipleship and soldiering, and we see it again here in 2 Timothy chapter 2. There's 3 elements to what Paul writes to Timothy here that I believe are helpful to us, what it means to be a soldier. The first one is about enduring hardship. The second is about maintaining focus. And the third lesson to learn is one of obedience, being obedient. Enduring hardship is a key or a common attribute that soldiers have to go through and have to put up with in the battles that they face. I enjoy looking at military history and studying and reading about what ordinary men and women have done in history, in historic times, how they've risen up when the time is necessary to wage war against an enemy. I've read books on the Second World War and other conflicts through the 20th century, and books on the First World War too. And I'm aware, and perhaps you are too, of some horrific hardships that soldiers endure in the battles that they face. Images and stories from the trenches of northern France and Belgium in the First World War. I'm also a big fan of a TV series called Band of Brothers, which was produced a number of years ago by some well-known Hollywood producers and directors, and it's a really effective, powerful story of a platoon of American parachute regiment from the D-Day landings in the Second World War at Normandy, and their journey through France towards Berlin to overthrow the Nazi regime and to drive the Nazis towards defeat. And one episode in the story of the Band of Brothers is they find themselves in some woodland in a place called Bastogne in the Ardennes forest, and there's a battle going on there, and it's winter, and the ground is frozen, so they're struggling to dig their foxholes, and they're hugging each other through the night to keep warm because it's so cold. And I remember one veteran speaking about that experience, and he says that when he goes to bed on a cold night with his wife, he says, "I'm glad I'm no longer in Bastogne." You know, soldiers have to experience extreme hardship in their pursuit of victory in the battle. And maybe that's true for you today. Maybe you feel that you are in a place of extreme hardship and you're facing some testing times, but you're holding on to the vision of victory. And I would encourage you to keep the vision of victory in sight, and that will help you in the hardships that you are currently facing. We can take encouragement, can't we, that Jesus Christ, our Lord and our Master, also endured hardship, horrific hardship. Isaiah 53 described him as a man of sorrows who was familiar with suffering. Being a disciple, a key element of it is to undergo and experience suffering. It's part of God's journey to help us come to maturity and to develop perseverance and to form a Christ-like character within us. Enduring hardship is a key facet of being a soldier of Jesus Christ. Paul wrote to the church in Colossae, and he wrote that he rejoices in what was suffered for you, and he fills up in his flesh what is still lacking in regards to Christ's afflictions for the sake of his body, which is the church. Paul recognized that suffering is a key facet of being a follower and a disciple. There's a famous passage too where Paul writes to the church in Corinth, and he lists the sufferings and the hardships that he endured in his discipleship journey. And in 2 Corinthians chapter 11, he lists some horrific hardships that he experienced. He says, 5 times he received from the Jews the 40 lashes minus 1. 3 times he was beaten with rods, and once he was stoned. 3 times shipwrecked. Spent a day and a night in the open sea. He's been constantly on the move. He's been in danger from rivers, in danger from bandits, and in danger from his own countrymen, and in danger from Gentiles, in danger in the city, and in danger in country, in danger at sea, in danger from false brothers. He's laboured and toiled and often gone without sleep. He's known hunger and thirst and has often gone without food. He's been cold, he's been naked, and besides everything else, he faces daily the pressure of his concern for all the churches that he was responsible for. An incredible list of challenges and hardships that Paul endured. Now, we may not have to go through that extent of hardship, but nevertheless, each of us in our pursuit of Jesus and in our seeking after him will inevitably have to face some hardships along the way. And let's remember the soldiers, the image of the soldier in those moments, the pursuit of victory. The vision of victory on the battlefield is what keeps you going in those hard times. The other observation to make about enduring hardship is we don't have to endure it alone. We don't have to endure it alone. You know, the discipleship journey, whilst on the one hand it is an individual journey, on the other hand we're not called to be in isolation or to survive on our own. The pattern and the themes of Scripture is to walk in partnership, in community, in unity with other believers, with brothers and sisters. And we don't have to endure hardships on our own. Let's lean on our brothers and sisters for support when it's needed. And there's no shame in that. You know, the soldiers in the trenches at Bastogne and in the Second World War, and the soldiers in the First World War, they didn't endure those hardships alone. They sought and found comradeship and deep friendships in those times of hardship. And the same can be true for you too. In the hardships that you're experiencing, lean on the friendships that you've developed and that you are developing, and they will also be a great support to you when you need them the most. In Galatians chapter 6 and verse 2, Paul writes to the church there and he says, bear one another's burdens. That's a great challenge and a great instruction for us as disciples. Let's bear one another's burdens. Let's carry the burdens. Let's share the concerns, the weight. Let's stand alongside each other in prayer and support to help each other in the hard times that we face. The second image of discipleship, or the second lesson of soldiering, is that soldiers maintain their focus. Paul writes to Timothy, he says, no one serving as a soldier gets involved in civilian affairs. Paul says that soldiers, he makes the observation that they maintain their focus. They don't allow distractions to come in the way of the vision of victory and the task at hand. Soldiers in World War I and in the trenches, they would have some time away from the front line. They would have some time away to rest. They could take leave, and I've read and seen, and perhaps you have too, in films and in books, that soldiers coming away from the front line, going back to England and having some time away, found it a difficult transition. They found it difficult to take the leave. They felt away from their comrades on the front line. They struggled with the thought of being at home resting while the battle was ongoing. They struggled between this tension between having some rest time away from the front line, and their minds were back where their training had taken them and where the task was. And Paul writes to Timothy and says, don't become distracted by civilian affairs. Don't get involved in things that don't really matter. Now, what Paul isn't saying here is that Timothy should neglect his earthly duties. You know, we have earthly responsibilities that we need to, on this earth, that it is important to fulfill as a disciple. Commitments to family, commitments to jobs and employers, commitments to the government, commitments to community. We have responsibilities that we should fulfill. Paul isn't saying disregard those. What Paul is saying is don't become distracted by temporal things of this earth. Don't become distracted by things that don't really matter. Keep your focus on what really matters. Keep your focus on the battle and following the instructions. That's a great question for us as disciples. Are there distractions in our life? Are our minds elsewhere when they should be on the battle and the instructions, the commands that we've been given as disciples? We need to be 100% dedicated to Jesus. We need to follow him wholeheartedly, not half-heartedly. Let's fix our eyes on Jesus, the author and the perfecter of our faith. Let's not allow distractions to come in the way of that. Things of this earth are passing and temporal, and let's fix our eyes on what is eternal and what truly matters when all is said and done. And the third observation from this passage in 2 Timothy chapter 2, the third observation about soldiering is obedience. Obedience for a soldier matters. Soldiers receive commands. They receive instructions from their commanding officer. And if they don't carry out those commands, there are consequences. There are potential charges of dereliction of duty. There's potential charges of insubordination. There's potential court-martials if things get really serious. Soldiers have to carry out the commands that they receive. If they do not, there are consequences. And it's taking that analogy and applying it to us. We have a commanding officer and his name is Jesus Christ. And he is issuing commands to his regiment today. And he expects his soldiers, his disciples, to carry out those commands. Because if they don't, the prospect of victory is limited. It's important that we as soldiers carry out the commands that we receive. What are the commands that Jesus is giving you? It comes down to understanding he has complete authority. All the way through Scripture, we see how Jesus spoke with authority. He taught with authority. Jesus said to his disciples, when he gave them that great commission, he said, all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Having conquered the grave, having been obedient himself to the commands that he had received, having stayed the course, all authority in heaven and on earth had been given to him. And he then instructs his disciples. Let's understand and recognize the authority that our commanding officer has. There's a great lesson for us to think about authority and obeying authority. And it comes in an encounter that Jesus had with a Roman centurion in Matthew chapter 8. And the story is Jesus was in a town called Capernaum, and a Roman soldier came to him, a Gentile, a man who was a symbol of power and oppression for the Jewish people at the time, a man who potentially had everything that he needed, but he had a situation that he couldn't solve himself. He had to humble himself and come to this poor local man called Jesus. And he came to Jesus and said, Lord, my servant lies at home paralyzed and in terrible suffering. And Jesus says, I'll go and heal him. What incredible grace and what incredible favour that Jesus shows to this Gentile, this centurion. And the centurion replied, and you can read the story in Matthew chapter 8, Lord, I don't deserve to even have you come under my roof. Just say the word, and I know that my servant will be healed. For I myself am a man under authority with soldiers under me. I tell this one, go, and he goes. I tell this one, come, and he comes. I say to my servant, do this, and he does it. And Jesus is astonished and astounded by the faith that this Gentile centurion demonstrates. And the centurion recognizes the authority that Jesus has. And he compares that authority to his experience and understanding that when he issues orders to his soldiers and to his servants, the job gets done. And he uses 3 instructions there that are helpful to us this morning. Go, come, and do this. And I'd like to leave you with those 3 words this morning, or those 3 phrases. Where is Jesus, your commanding officer, asking you to go? Is Jesus asking you to come to him this morning, to come closer, to draw close to him? And thirdly, what is Jesus asking you to do? Go, come, and do this. For the centurion, those jobs got done, and if they didn't, there were consequences. And Jesus is issuing those commands to us today, his disciples. Go into all the world, preach the gospel, make disciples. Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened. I will give you rest. Do this. What is Jesus, your commanding officer, asking you to do? There's 3 great lessons for us as disciples, looking at what it means to be soldiers. Let's endure hardship for the sake of Christ, because Jesus himself was a man of sorrows, familiar with suffering, and God can use those hard times to train us, to strengthen us, to develop resilience and perseverance within us. And it becomes easier to endure the hardship when we maintain the vision of victory on the battlefield. Jesus has won the victory. He has paid the price, and we can enjoy the benefits of that victory. So let's stay the course and let's hang in there for him, and let's overcome the difficulties and the obstacles that we may face. Let's lean on the support of friends. Let's endure hardships as good soldiers of Jesus Christ. Let's maintain our focus. Let's not become entangled and distracted by earthly things that are, at the end of the day, don't really matter too much. Let's maintain our focus on him. And finally, let's be obedient, recognizing his authority. Go, come, and do this. Paul writes in verse 7 of 2 Timothy chapter 2, he says, reflect on what I'm saying, for the Lord will give you insight into all this. And I pray that through this message, and as you reflect on what you've heard, that as you meditate on it, and as you allow God to speak to you by his Spirit, that he will give you greater insight in your pursuit of him. Consider what's been said. May the Lord give you insight into this. God bless you. God keep you. And may God's grace go with you. And I'll see you again soon. Bye for now.